Medieval scholars were convinced that God divided people into three main social groups: priests, oratores, warriors, bellatores, and laborers, laboratores. They believed this division was valid from the beginning until the end of the earthly world. The worst position in medieval society was held by the laboring class. This group included everyone who made their living by manual work, whether they were personally free or lived under serfdom. These included mostly peasants, who made up to 90% of the population in medieval Europe. Close cooperation among all household members was essential in the everyday life of a peasant family during the High Middle Ages. The family was not only a social unit, but primarily an economic unit. Peasants often lived in small villages where community life played a significant role, and their main livelihood was based on fieldwork. Gender roles in medieval society were relatively strongly defined. The head of the family and the household was typically the eldest man, the father of the family. Although medieval society was patriarchal, the man's role as head of the family was less strict than in the earlier classical period. In ancient Rome, the father of the family, pater familias in Latin, held legal power over the rest of the family. In medieval Europe, the leading role was primarily economic. He was the main breadwinner of the family, responsible for the household's economic functioning, and his duties included negotiating with the lord. The primary tasks for men in a rural family were sowing, plowing, harvesting, and handling the most physically demanding work, especially related to livestock care. Women performed physically less demanding tasks, though no less important. They were mainly responsible for preparing meals, maintaining the household, and weaving fabrics, which could provide an additional income for the family. They also took care of domestic animals. If her husband was absent or had died, the woman would take on full responsibility for running the household. Children were also involved in the work process. Younger children were assigned simpler tasks, such as gathering wood, while older children worked in the fields, in the household, or learned a trade alongside their parents, depending on their gender. A typical day for peasants started very early in the morning. First, the livestock had to be fed, followed by a family breakfast. After breakfast, they would head to the fields, and their work followed seasonal changes. Lunch was often eaten in the fields and was simple but nourishing. In the late afternoon, peasants returned to the village to complete other tasks. Men might repair tools, tend to livestock, or maintain the household, while women cared for the children, cooked, or wove. Evening was a time for rest and prayer. People from the village also visited one another and engaged in community life. About the food that was consumed during the day, we will talk about later. As mentioned earlier, the family was an economic unit. Unlike modern society, where the basic economic unit is the individual, the family was considered the cornerstone of the feudal economy. All family members contributed to its functioning according to their age and abilities. Work directly impacted the family's survival. A peasant family was essentially self-sufficient in producing food and meeting basic needs, relying on neighbors only when necessary. The diet of a medieval peasant was simple and heavily reliant on seasonal crops and the resources available on the farm. Plant-based foods made up a significant portion of their meals because meat was rare and often eaten only during special occasions or celebrations. Basic diet of a peasant. Bread. Bread made from various grains such as rye, barley, and, when available, wheat, was the staple food. It was the most common component of breakfast, lunch, and often dinner. Porridge and grain dishes. Porridge made from oats, rye, or wheat was another frequent meal component. This porridge was usually cooked with water or milk when available and was a regular part of lunch and dinner. Vegetables and legumes. The diet was rich in vegetables like cabbage, onions, garlic, carrots, turnips, and kale, as well as legumes such as beans and peas. Dairy products. When a family owned livestock, they consumed milk, butter, and cheese, but in small quantities. Cheese, being durable, was especially important during the winter. Meat and fish. Meat was a rarity for peasants, but occasionally they ate poultry, pork, or beef, particularly during the autumn when animals were slaughtered. If meat was available, small portions were eaten during field lunches and communal dinners. Fish became important during fasting periods. Dining by seasons. Spring. Spring was often a time of scarcity as the previous harvest supplies had been used up and new crops were not yet ready. People relied on preserved foods like dried legumes, grains, and products like cheese. As soon as fresh vegetables began to grow, they were added to the diet. Summer. Summer was a time of abundance with fresh vegetables and fruits like pears, apples, and berries. Peasants also harvested grain for bread making. Autumn. Autumn was the peak harvest season when stores were most plentiful. It was also the time for animal slaughter, with the meat being preserved by salting or smoking for the winter. Vegetables like cabbage and kale were stored for the colder months. Winter. In winter, peasants depended on preserved foods such as smoked meat, salted fish, dried fruits, grain porridge, and legumes. The diet was at its poorest during the season since no fresh crops were available. Festivals and celebrations were important aspects of peasant social life and often included richer meals than what they could afford on a regular basis. Some of the most significant celebrations included Harvest Festival. After the harvest, celebrations were held where freshly gathered grain, meat, and seasonal fruits were consumed. It was a time of plenty where people enjoyed the fruits of their labor. Christmas. The Christmas holiday was a special time when families ate richer foods, often including meat, fish, baked bread, pies, and beer. Easter. After the long fasting period, Easter provided an opportunity to eat meat again, along with richer foods. The Easter table might feature roasted lamb or chicken, eggs, and fresh vegetables if available. The mentalities of medieval people regarding gender relations were dramatically different from today's Western perspective. European society was patriarchal, and men generally held a dominant position, while women were seen primarily as wives and mothers. The Church sought to regulate people's sexuality by enforcing strict moral standards. According to Church teachings, the primary purpose of sexual relations was procreation, and any other form of sexual expression, such as extramarital relations or intercourse for pleasure, was considered sinful. However, it would be naive to assume that such behaviors did not occur. The Church in the Middle Ages did not have effective means to strictly enforce these rules. Marriage was considered a sacrament and a fundamental building block of Christian society. The Church ensured that marriages were always solemnized with its blessing, adhering to clear rules. While extramarital relationships did occur, they were condemned, and children born from such unions were often discriminated against, especially regarding inheritance rights. Fertility was high during the Middle Ages, but it was balanced by a high rate of infant mortality. Women often gave birth frequently, as the survival of the family depended on having enough children. The Church encouraged fertility, as it aligned with the notion of expanding the Christian community. Contraception was prohibited, as it was considered sinful for preventing conception, which was seen as the primary purpose of marital intimacy. Nevertheless, there is evidence that people tried to avoid conception using herbal mixtures, though such practices were kept secret due to fear of church sanctions. The life of medieval peasants was closely tied to the changing seasons and the seasonal tasks that dictated their daily routines and the rhythm of their lives. Spring was a time when peasants prepared for the new agriculture year. Early tasks included plowing and loosening the soil using a plow, often pulled by livestock. Spring work also involved planting cereals, especially barley and oats, and other crops like legumes. The working days were often long, as it was necessary to complete the sowing before the weather changed or temperatures rose. Summer was a period when farmers focused on caring for their growing crops. During this time, they weeded and hoed the fields to give the crops enough room to grow. Peasants also tended to their pastures and ensured that livestock had enough to eat. The peak of the summer was the harvest. Harvesting grain was physically demanding work that required the participation of the entire community. The grain was cut using sickles or scythes and then dried and bundled into sheaves. Often it was a collective effort, where neighbors helped each other ensure that the harvest was completed quickly before the weather turned. Autumn was the time for the final harvests and preparations for winter. During the autumn, fruits, vegetables, and other crops were gathered and stored for the winter months. This was also the time for threshing grain and storing it to ensure a food supply for the winter. It was essential to prepare the food reserves well, as a lack of food in winter could lead to famine. Peasants also spent time repairing homes and farm buildings. Winter was a time of rest from strenuous field work, but that did not mean that peasants were without tasks. In winter, Peasants focused on maintaining agriculture tools, repairing houses, and preparing for spring. Animals were often kept indoors, which required more effort in their care and feeding. Winter was also a time for processing food supplies, drying and smoking meat, and preserving it for the months to come. Medieval people's ideas about death and the afterlife were shaped by Christian beliefs and, in rural areas, were often combined with surviving pagan superstitions. Death in the Middle Ages was not seen solely as the end of physical life, but primarily as a transition to the afterlife. Death was considered a natural part of existence, but also a moment that could determine whether one would enjoy eternal life in paradise or face damnation in hell. Many religious practices such as confession, prayers, or almsgiving were aimed at preparing the soul for the moment of death and ensuring salvation. The last rites, known as extreme unction, were crucial for ensuring that the dying person passed into the afterlife reconciled with God. Funeral rituals were an important part of medieval Christian culture. After death, the body was washed, dressed in burial shrouds, and placed in a coffin. Funerals usually took place quickly, as it was not possible to preserve the body for long without preservatives. Burials occurred in local parishes or nearby cemeteries. The priest played a key role during the funeral, offering prayers for the deceased to ensure their passage to heaven. Masses for the dead were a common part of funeral rituals. Attitudes toward illness were also strongly linked to religion, as medical knowledge at the time was limited. People often turned to God with prayers for healing. Care for the elderly and the sick was typically provided by the family or local community, following the Christian teaching of mercy. Monasteries were more organized institutions that provided basic health care along with spiritual support. Elderly and sick individuals in monasteries were encouraged to pray and receive sacraments to prepare for death in case recovery did not come. Death itself often occurred in the presence of a priest and family members, who gathered around the dying person's bed, where they would watch and pray. This was meant to help the soul transition to the afterlife.